Look, I think it was always likely that Richard Marles, as Defence Minister, would pay a visit to Papua New Guinea, particularly because Australia has, in recent years, really ploughed quite a bit of energy and money into the relationship, and in particular the security and defence relationship with PNG, as well as all the things it's been doing, of course, with development work and the like. But there has been a particularly sharp focus on security issues over the last couple of years, in particular as Australia has become increasingly anxious about China's growing influence in the region. It's at the same time, simultaneously, been trying to do everything that it can to really ramp up defence cooperation with those countries in the region that have defence forces, including, of course, PNG. So we've seen the announcement a few years ago to develop the Lombrum Naval Base in Manus Island with the US. That's a pretty big signature announcement from the former government, and one the current one is pursuing. And then, of course, more recently, an attempt to really add a bit of momentum to those talks to strike a formal treaty or security treaty with PNG. Now, this has also formally been in the works for a couple of years, maybe a little bit less, but the new foreign minister in PNG, Justin Chichenko, has seemed determined to get negotiations moving again, saying he would like to see that agreement struck by the end of the year. And I think that's one of the reasons that Richard Marles has made the trip to Papua New Guinea, to discuss that. Now, what would a treaty mean? Well, Richard Marles has been at pains to say during this trip that, in a sense, it would really be formalising what's already there. There's already pretty deep cooperation between Australia and PNG when it comes to defence, in particular when it comes to training. Large numbers of people within the PNG Defence Forces will come to Australia for training. But Richard Marles says putting a treaty-level agreement in place would really bed it down and formalise and elevate a lot of that cooperation, as well as opening up new opportunities for Australia and Papua New Guinea to intensify engagement. Richard Marles has also made it clear that Australia is perhaps willing to do more to really plug what he calls capability gaps in PNG across the army and as well as potentially the maritime and air areas. So it would be interesting to see what Australia is willing to stump up potentially in that space. But a defence treaty formalising and elevating that security relationship is probably a first step that has to be completed before some of that can happen.
Interestingly too, Stephen, the Foreign Minister Penny Wong is again visiting the region.
Yes, that's right. Foreign Minister Penny Wong is making yet another trip to the Pacific, and the intensity of her diplomacy, the outreach that we've seen over the 5 months or so since Labor's taken office, or 4 months or so really since Labor's taken office, has been quite something to see. The fact that she's taken so many trips to the Pacific speaks to the government's ambition to really reinforce Australia's relationships in the region and, of course, protect and expand where possible Australia's influence in the region. Now, this time around, Penny Wong is making a trip to Micronesia, to the North Pacific, both to the Republic of the Marshall Islands and to Nauru as well. Now, the focus there, well, of course, there's a focus on a range of issues, including, in particular, security ties and development, but probably the most pressing issue for these countries, and one of the main things on the government's radar here, is, of course, climate policy. And there's been a pretty sharp focus of that today in the Republic of Marshall Islands, where Senator Wong has done a number of things, but taking a look at Australia's aid projects in the region, touring areas that have been impacted by climate change, and fielding questions from the press in Marshall Islands about Australia's commitments on this front.
The security pact, Stephen, between Solomon Islands and China has, of course, raised concerns. Now, Solomons have sent 32 police officers for training. Does that raise some red flags?
Yeah, this is a police training program which has been underway for about 10 months or so. But what we saw just over the weekend, the weekend just passed, is a new step up in that program with a contingent, as you mentioned, of 32 police officers going to China for training in a range of police techniques. We don't really know exactly what this training will cover. The press release from the Royal Solomon Islands Police Force was pretty broad and general in the language used. But evidently they're going to continue to learn new techniques to try and improve policing. Now, this will be a source of some unease in Australia. We've already seen both senior Australian intelligence officials and very senior Australian police officers publicly raise concerns about this deepening of cooperation between Chinese and Solomon Islands police forces. We saw a senior intelligence official, Andrew Shearer, say earlier that he didn't think it was appropriate for China to be applying or training Solomon Islands police with the tactics that they used, as he put it, so brutally to suppress protests in Hong Kong. He said use of force and the police tactics that we saw by the Chinese officers in Hong Kong, if applied in a place like Solomon Islands, could actually contribute to instability in the country, which has, of course, already been racked by riots in multiple occasions over the last couple of decades. Police officers, for their part, say that they don't want to see anything with other countries, unnamed, that could disrupt the existing and very deep cooperation between Australia and Solomon Islands police officers. So there's clearly a bit of signalling, both publicly and privately, from Australia here, saying that we're uneasy about the way that this is being rolled out. Of course, it might also present some awkward questions if, in the event Solomon Islands invited Chinese police into the country to help quell unrest, how that would work and how they would work together with Australian police officers who are already on the ground. That would present, as Australian officials have put it, unity of command issues. So these are very fraught questions, but Solomon Islands seems intent on trying to turn to China as well as Australia for police training. They evidently see a gap there, and it's a development that's going to be watched very closely and with a great deal of unease in Australia.
Appreciate your time, Stephen. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Beverly.